Good morning, Bitcoiners. Welcome back to your economic calendar with the information you need to start the week off right in Bitcoin. As always, I'm Mauricio Di Bartolomeo here at Ledn, and today is Thursday, January 26th. Now, as you know, Bitcoin has had some phenomenal 2 weeks, and so far this week it has been holding ground. In today's issue, we're going to focus on 4 trends that are or could be behind the new positive sentiment and positive price action that we're seeing. Among those 4 are the positive updates around some recent systemic bankruptcies in the space, namely the FTX and the Genesis bankruptcies. We're also going to talk about what is happening with Bitcoin in Nigeria, where it is coming to the rescue. We'll get into why. We're also going to talk about central banks that might be starting to change a beat. We saw some interesting change of tone from the Bank of Canada this week, and we'll talk about how this could potentially impact future decisions. The Federal Reserve is scheduled to make a new interest rate announcement next week. And last but certainly not least, we're going to talk about corporate earnings in the US, which on the technology side and those Bitcoin affiliated companies have had results that are surpassing investor expectations, which probably has something to do with the recent optimism. And last but not least, we're going to get into what's on Q4 Friday, where we get another read at US inflation, and of course, the Fed meeting next week. So lots to cover. Grab your coffees. It's going to be a great one. And as always, let's take a quick look at Bitcoin price action before we get into today's show. Bitcoin moved higher by more than 8% last week, actually almost 9% higher last week, and has maintained positive momentum so far this week, largely on the back of some positive developments that we'll discuss shortly. But first, let's take a look at some technicals in terms of price and this chart. Now, as you can see from this chart, the recent rally has taken the relative strength index to levels not seen since early 2021. And the relative strength index is these lines right here that we'll get into in a second. Now, typically, we see the RSI reach similar levels in the early or middle stages of a bull run as it happened. So again, this is the RSI, this line here, and I've highlighted these yellow bubbles to see the level that we're at now, what current price is and what Bitcoin prices have done in the past when levels of the RSI have reached a similar point. As you can see, we saw a similar level here on January 2021 when we were basically in the middle of this very big bull run, and we saw similar levels again around April 2019 when we were getting off this base around the mid threes and moved north to eventually north of 10K. Now, when the RSI breaches north of 70, it suggests that an asset may be overbought, meaning that the short-term trend would be for the asset price to stabilize or drop. Historically, when the RSI has reached similar levels, Bitcoin's price ascent has taken a pause or took a pause until the RSI came back below 70, and then it continued moving higher. We saw this basically here in January, and we saw this again in April. So if Bitcoin can stabilize around the current level that it is at now and allows for and trades around this level for a few days, it would allow the RSI to come back below 70 and put the chart in a much healthier position and even better setup for the medium term. Now, the biggest test on this price stability will likely come next week as the Federal Reserve is set to announce another interest rate decision that would likely or will likely impact markets. Now, as many of you in the Bitcoin space know, it's very tricky to effectively determine where Bitcoin is headed in the near term. And that is why tools like Bitcoin-backed loans are so useful, because they allow people to access cash without being subject to the current price that Bitcoin is at when they need that liquidity. And then you can take time and decide to close that Bitcoin at a later time when you see a price that's more favorable to you. A reminder, Ledn Bitcoin-backed loans can be accessed in a matter of minutes, and they don't require monthly interest payments. All interest payments accrue until the time you want to repay the loan. You can repay the loan at any time, no penalties. So when Bitcoin has these types of moves, as you have seen, the demand for these types of products grows because there's obviously a big incentive to not sell Bitcoin as it's moving higher. So as I mentioned, in today's show, we're going to get into 4 drivers and or trends that could be behind the recent optimism in crypto asset prices and largely influencing Bitcoin's recent rally. The number one point that we want to touch on in today's analysis is the improving prospects of asset recovery for people that were impacted by the 2 largest bankruptcies in our industry. As you know, many people have suffered from the recent bankruptcies that we've seen, namely the FTX bankruptcy and the Genesis bankruptcy. And as of recently, a lot of progress has been made that signals that investors that have been impacted could be looking to recover a lot more in terms of assets than they initially expected. Let's get into that news and put this article on the screen at the moment. So, as I mentioned, one of the big reasons behind the recent optimism behind Bitcoin and other crypto assets is this fact that the outlooks of asset recovery around 2 of these very systemic bankruptcies have been improving recently. And case in point is the article on your screen that talks about how FTX customer accounts have risen in value after the bankruptcy lawyers reported that they had found $5 billion worth of cash and other liquid assets. Now, the news caused the value of FTX account claims to surge from around 2 to 5 cents on the dollar in mid-November to north of 14 cents on the dollar after the most recent announcement. And what this means is that people that had assets trapped on FTX were getting bids or offers from other investors specialized in this types of activity, and they were essentially buying the entire amount of the person's claim of assets that they had trapped in FTX for cents on the dollar. At the very early stages of the bankruptcy, they were offering to pay between 2 and 5 cents. Now that all these assets have been found, these offers are much higher, north of 14 cents. So this means that the people that had assets trapped on FTX now have the ability to recover even more today in terms of cents on the dollar and have better prospects if they wait out the entire process of getting more assets back than they initially thought. So that is on the FTX side. And beyond that, just to kind of keep making further reference to this, the Wall Street Journal reported that investors were making higher offers for FTX customer accounts trapped in bankruptcy after the news of the assets found came to light. And beyond this, the interim CEO of FTX even floated the idea, I'm going to put this article on the screen, of restarting the exchange, which presumably could allow investors to recover even more of their assets and faster than if they were to wait through the entire bankruptcy process. Now that's for FTX. On the Genesis front, there's also been some positive developments. Genesis' lawyers told the bankruptcy court judge on Monday this week that they expect to reach an agreement with their creditors by the end of this week, so by tomorrow potentially. If Genesis is able to structure an agreement with its creditors, it would save all of the parties involved millions of dollars in lawyer fees, and it would save investors multiple years waiting for a court resolution. Both of these developments, what we're seeing on the FTX front and on the Genesis front, would greatly improve the financial conditions of millions of crypto investors and are likely a big driver behind the recent optimism and positive sentiment. The second trend and or development that we want to talk about is what is happening in Nigeria and how Bitcoin is coming to the rescue. So we're going to make reference to the article on your screen. So last week, the Nigerian central bank imposed a new limit on cash withdrawals as it continues to roll out new banknotes in the country. The move is being seen by locals as a way to reduce the use of cash and increase control and oversight of all financial transactions. Now, these types of measures are common in countries facing inflationary pressures and lack of trust in their currency. I experienced very similar policies in Venezuela, and instead of slowing down inflation, these types of aggressive moves tend to actually reduce the public trust in the government's ability to contain inflation and causes inflation to surge even higher in most instances that I've been aware of these types of moves or attempts. Now, since the announcement, and Nigerians are very brilliant, and they were one of the first adopters of digital assets for a reason. Since the announcement, search interest for buy Bitcoin in Nigeria has skyrocketed. And you can see that in this screen. It is at its highest point, the highest point that it has ever been. And it is effectively the only dot in the entire planet that is very, very deep blue at this, showing this type of search intent. This should not come as a surprise. Nigerians are turning to Bitcoin to protect their savings from further devaluation. And furthermore, trust in local banks and institutions is very low, and many Nigerians feel safer transacting on the Bitcoin network rather than their local banking network. And the third point we want to touch on today is what the Bank of Canada did this week and what that may foreshadow for other major central banks in the weeks and months to come. As per the article on your screen, the Bank of Canada this week became the first major central bank to suggest that it will be pausing future interest rate hikes after it announced a 25 basis points increase on Wednesday. And the news here is referenced on your screen by the CBC. Now, the Bank of Canada, which is Canada's central bank, announced this week that it will be pausing future interest rate hikes after increasing interest rates by another 25 basis points. Now, while it is still an increase in the interest rate, the Bank of Canada very clearly signaled to the market that this would be its last increase for now. While the Canadian bank has lost some credibility by stating a while back that rates would remain low for several years, it was just a year ago that they said that, and of course they did not keep that promise. It still signals that these statements still signal an important change in tone and policy relative to the last meeting. This could be a sign of things to come at more central banks, and it has strengthened this narrative that global central bank tightening could be peaking or very near its peak. Now, interestingly, on this point, the U.S. Federal Reserve will be meeting next week, and they are expected to announce a 25 basis points increase. Now, investors will be paying close attention to what Fed officials say in terms of future guidance and any other type of commentary that Mr. Jerome Powell will add, any color that he will add at the press conference after the announcement. So markets will be very, very there's going to be great expectation for this new interest rate decision from the Fed, not just the number, but also what kind of commentary they give for the guidance they give for the future meeting. And the fourth point that we wanted to discuss today is the recent corporate earnings that we have seen in the United States, namely in technology companies and companies affiliated with Bitcoin or digital assets. And there's an article on your screen that we're going to make reference to in a second. Now, on the earnings front, many investors were expecting a bloodbath for technology companies and any company that was affiliated with Bitcoin and or digital assets. But the results to date have actually been quite the opposite. An example here is the article on your screen that states that on the Bitcoin front, we saw that Signature Bank beat earnings estimates and posted record profits. The stock moved higher 5% after the report. And similarly, Tesla's report beat analyst expectations, and the company announced that it had made no changes to its Bitcoin position during the fourth quarter of 2022. Tesla's stock rallied 8% after the earnings report earlier this week. Now, in other tech news, Netflix posted positive results, and so did Microsoft. Both stocks rallied after their respective reports. In terms of what's up next, Intel is expected to report later today, and Intel has been reported to be working on a chip to mine Bitcoin. So any update on that front could potentially impact markets. So keep an ear out for the Intel earnings later today. And as always, we wrap up with a summary of what you can expect for the week ahead. Now, even though today is Thursday already and this video came out a few days later than usual, we do want to highlight that later today we get the results from Intel, who is working on a Bitcoin mining chip and potentially could move markets with that report if it addresses any material changes on that project or progress on that project. And tomorrow we have another important economic data point with the personal consumption expenditures index, which is just another read on inflation in the US that the Fed follows very closely. Expectation here is for PCE to come in a little bit higher for December than it was in November. So 0.3% month over month increase in December versus 0.2 in November. A number higher than 0.3 could potentially cause markets to sell off. A number lower than 0.2 could show progress towards the direction the Fed wants to go, and so markets could cheer a result lower than 0.2. And we also have earnings from American Express, Chevron, and Colgate on Friday. And importantly, we have a Fed meeting next week, which is why we had no Fed speeches during this week. And markets could potentially be bracing themselves for that decision and all the data that will come out next Wednesday. So with that, we have reached the end of today's show. Of course, as always, we welcome you to drop us your comments and feedback in the comments section below. If you don't yet have a Ledn account, I welcome you to check us out at ledn.io and learn more about what we offer in our industry-leading Bitcoin-backed loans. If you enjoyed today's show, I welcome you to thumbs up it, subscribe to our channel, and share it with your friends. And I will see you next week. Ciao, ciao, y los quiero mucho.